the joint meeting of the select board and the Needham Planning Board. From the select board, I think, we have everybody here. We've just confirmed that Mr. Nelson, who is online, can hear us and we can hear them. So let me turn to Mr. Block.
For the planning board, we have Jean McKnight and Artie Crocker, Natasha Spada, and I understand Paul Elper are recused for the second part of our agenda. I don't know, Lee, are you here? Lee, do you know if they're participating in the first part of our agenda?
I have not heard.
Okay. We have a quorum, so we can continue.
Okay. All right. The first item on the agenda this evening was to discuss the special town meeting draft warrant article, foster property, open space zoning, non-binding resolution. So I did just want to speak with you all as the planning board to say that the select board has put this into the draft warrant at this point. The foster property continues to be challenging to bring to a close, is what I would say. Town meeting a year ago expressed their very strong support and provided a vote that provided funding for the acquisition of 34 acres of open space for $2.5 million, but that was a secondary transaction to an initial transaction that the developer would be making from the seller. That transaction has not fully come together, and as I believe you know, because we've spoken in public session, we discussed a draft development agreement. The draft development agreement was never filed. All right, and at this point, what we know from the state is that the state, although we had originally been told that they would accept 5% affordable units on that property, and we went forward with that because our primary purpose for acquisition was for open space. They've now indicated that they will only accept 25% affordable under a LIP on that property. So after spending the summer working with the state to try to understand were there other options that might be possible, we are continuing to pursue all possible options, but one of those options would be a rezoning of the parcel of 484 Charles River, if I've got the address right. A rezoning of that parcel so that I don't fully know exactly what the zoning would say, but it would say something to the effect of provided that it resulted in acquisition by the town of, greater than 50% of the property for open space purposes, that it could be constructed with clustered zoning with a provision for 5% affordability. So it would say something to that effect. So our thought was to give town meeting again an opportunity to weigh in on that. There was a particular type of transaction that was talked about a year ago. Doing zoning is different, and sometimes people feel differently about zoning, so we would offer that option. And bring it forward and see what the sense was of town meeting, whether they were interested in our continuing to put our investment of time into this acquisition of open space. It's not so much a financial question because of course they did give the authorization a year ago for the $2.5 million, and we are not seeking additional funding. We are just seeking a sense of town meeting with whether we should make this investment of time going forward. So I'll open it up for any questions from you.
The planning board hasn't had an opportunity to discuss or even review the draft and to discuss it collectively, the draft resolution.
But this is our opportunity, isn't it?
But this is our opportunity, Jean.
Mhm.
So
How much time are we allocated to?
for this
Well,
agenda
Yes,
item,
for
We
this item.
just had about 10 minutes
Yes.
really to answer
Yeah.
some questions
so that-
on this
okay.
one.
Okay, so it's not a lot of time.
do you have any questions?
No, I haven't had a chance to look at it, so. I think so, no, there aren't really, I don't really have a lot of questions. I mean, I know town meeting said yes to what they wanted to do. And back then I always had a question of the percentage of affordable housing. So I would still have that question about the percentage of affordable housing. I would also have the question of At that point, I think there was a question, perhaps a question was, who was gonna pay for the infrastructure as far as anything along Charles River related to that project? And I still have that question of who's gonna fund that infrastructure change related to that project. So that's the only questions I have at this point, actually.
What type of infrastructural cost do you envision?
Anything that's related, crossings, sidewalks, signs, I don't know what it would be, but there's gonna be something going on there.
Utilities and so on.
Yeah, there's gonna be something, I just don't know what it'll be.
So we would expect that the zoning would would go through a regular zoning review process that, if we were to ask you to take up the zoning, that would require public hearings, et cetera. And similarly, if there were a project, that the project would go before the planning board.
And that, if that project came to the planning board, I presume that as with any other developer, they'd be responsible for the costs of mitigation if there was any that needed to be done, and they would do the typical, they would pay like they always do for other infrastructural improvements related to the development.
And that wasn't what was stated last year, although perhaps because it was going through a lift, perhaps they had second thoughts of who would pay for it, because the developer said they were not going to pay for it.
Not gonna
I
pay
don't
for it
recall the
specifically.
developer saying that, but the developer would have gone
Yeah.
before the ZBA and there would have been a discussion.
The point being is I had the question, then I never, and I never never heard an answer for who's actually gonna pay for the infrastructure. So it would still be a question. And, I mean, I think it's great. I think bringing housing into town is needed. It's great. As always, I just have a question about, actually, two questions. So the percentage of affordable housing, and to make sure there's enough buffer between Whitman Road neighbors and that project.
So the other thing I expect this zoning would be specific on would be the amount of buffer and setbacks that might be required for this project, which was committed to previously.
Yeah, I would expect as with all of our zoning, we include a dimensional regulation that would have a setback. And you know, and we proposed something that I think was what was expected in the most recent iteration of the previous town meeting, if we did move forward with it.
Yeah, I think I remember something about 100 feet, but
That's correct.
which is not enough, actually, which is actually not enough. Because I've actually looked at it, and so for me, it would not be enough for between those neighbors in this project. I wish it was, but I've looked at it and I've looked at my street, that's what I'm saying, it's not enough. So that's just where I'm coming from right now.
And I don't know that there's a plan approved by the planning board that expressly says providing access to the Charles River and protecting the areas around the Charles River is an important goal. But I think certainly we members of the planning board feel that way. And I know with regard to one of the subdivision projects that we worked on, we did our best to get at least a conservation easement along the Charles River. We were hoping to get public access. But this project I have personally followed very closely. I'm a member of the board of Needham Land Trust, and Needham Land Trust has followed this project, is not directly involved, but has followed this project and supported it. And I was very surprised at the thought that the state would approve a local initiative project with only 5% affordability. And I know they said they would, but that apparently didn't come from the top. I don't know. But to hear that they've changed their mind, that they won't do this unless it's 25% doesn't surprise me. The thing that I am concerned about is we have a goal expressed in our town's housing plan of uniformly applying a 12.5% affordability requirement throughout our town. And that means one affordable unit for every 8 units, and add a level affordable to those at or below 80% of median, the usual 80% of median type of whether it's a condominium, a price, or a rental. And I hate to get away from that and say this is an exception because the town wants to acquire this land. I really is torn about that. And I wonder if any discussions have been had with the proposed developer of land sellers to make the project work. I can realize why 25% wouldn't work, of course, but will 12.5% work? Has anybody had any discussion along those lines?
So, what would be true, right, is that that's a less economically viable project,
Then
right? And it
5%.
will require additional funding,
Mhm.
right? Either that additional funding has to come from the town or the seller has to cut his price,
Mhm.
okay? The town, certainly the select board is not seeking additional funding from the town. There are many reasons why we would choose not to do that at this point. The other option is that the developer could create a project that is denser. That is not something we've asked the developer to do. All right, but economics comes from a variety of factors,
Mhm.
and factors would need to change in order to make the greater number possible.
And I realize that, just moving on to a different subject and agreeing with Adam and with you, Marianne, that this would most likely be the kind of rezoning that we typically do, before the rezoning is approved, the planning board recommends adoption of the rezoning, and the select board does the same thing. We want to be we want to be satisfied that the development will be done this way in general. And also, I assume that the zoning will require a special permit. I mean, that the development will require a special permit, and the zoning will say a special permit is required
By use or by site plan review, major project special permit?
by use. And therefore, whatever discretion, the high level of discretion that you have when you require a special permit would be able to be applied, and whatever mitigation is needed would be able to be and if I'm wrong, please somebody tell me, but that I would think would be what people expect.
You-
I don't think we've talked about that yet, right?
This is really just, should we
Conceptual.
talk about it?
So as a conceptual matter, I'll back up one more step and then I'll talk about it conceptually.
And I note it's 5:15, so all of the above apply, but yes.
And we may have Natasha join. I think Lee, she may try to, but she doesn't have the invite. You're able to resend it to her if you have time. The finance committee has reached out to me, their chair. And they also want to talk about the resolution with the planning board or chair and vice chair. And I had a preliminary conversation with their chair, and they'll be sending a list of questions that they have about the resolution. And then the board will talk about that, and then we'll respond and either meet or respond in some way to the finance committee. And we're happy to do that and to speak to the finance committee. Conceptually, I think Artie and Jean are speaking about a specific mechanics of the construction of the zoning bylaw, which is not currently contemplated. I think as a matter of conception, we're just talking about if town meeting approves the non-binding resolution that the planning board would take up as zoning, and we would go through our ordinary zoning planning process in time for May town meeting. And we have time. When is town meeting? The end of October, October 30. So Lee, I apologize. When would we need to have a public hearing by roughly in order to meet May? Probably sometime in January.
February, probably the latest.
February would be the latest. So
If it was done within a special, it could go a little bit later into February.
okay, so there is certainly ample time to prepare a draft resolution of a zoning bylaw for us to preliminarily resolve the framework for the dimensional regulations and these other items that both Artie and Jean have talked about. And then come to a resolution of proposed language, have the public hearing, revisit the language as we ordinarily do and proceed. So we certainly have the time. And it seems like where town meeting, and I know that it was a contentious question for a while, or a contentious debate, but yet at the end of the day, town meeting approved the authorization for the global purpose, for the benefit of the whole of the town, of acquiring how many acres of open land.
34.
There is a mechanical way in which to make it conservation, yet ultimately, at the end of the day, we all agree that if the town does acquire that land, it would be available as public land for use by residents, including access to the Charles. So I think having that municipal benefit removes a question that some may have had about spot zoning, and we don't have to get into the technical machinations of the zoning bylaw presently, but I think that, town meeting is a legislative representative body of the town. They wish to move forward, and that's resolved in October by the resolution. I think it behooves us to take it before town meeting.
So I'm not sure how having public land be part of this deal takes away from the fact that it's spot zoning. I'm not saying I'm against it, or anything. I'm just saying I'm not sure how that changes the definition of spot zoning. We would have to have a traffic study of that area. Is that entrance, anywhere near that entrance are in literally the curviest section of Charles River Street, I believe. And so I have some concerns about that. We'd have to have a traffic study, something to tell us, some idea what's going on.
All of that follows the ordinary process.
It follows a process, we'd have to have that. And I don't know for a fact this is possible to have it May town meeting, because we have other things we're not doing. Because we wanted to make sure we had time to do the things we wanted for town meetings.
So let me ask.
So I know for a fact we have time to do this correctly.
So
I'm not saying I don't want to, but I know if we have time.
That's valid, because you're raising the question of capacity, and that's valid, and we do have a number of other items that we're working diligently on to pursue for a zoning bylaw change in May. Some of those are within our control and some of those are not. But it might be helpful if, we can find alternative resources if necessary in order to make May town meeting work. To help with the preparation of the zoning bylaw, as long as it all happens in the ordinary time frame in which these things must.
I think if that's a priority, I think it can be met. We may have to pull in some additional resources to facilitate it, but this is a significant property in town. It's a significant resource that's certainly worthy of preservation.
Another question
So-
I would have is, have we
Artie,
actually
Can I
determined on the property? There's a lower level of the property, which is almost technically some version of floodplains of some kind. So one question I have is, how much of that property is actually developable? And how much of that property, if the developer bought it, put a project on it, whatever project it was, then the developer would have some land he was never going to use, and he might very well give it to conservation, so we're gonna have to pay taxes on it. So I mean, I've always had that question as far as how much is actually developable on that property. That's the question I've always had, and I don't think we've finalized that answer also.
I was gonna say, we certainly understand that land is developable because we've been told that.
By who?
But this particular project did not contemplate developing there, so it becomes a non-issue for us
But
because that
who
would be
told us,
open
who told
space.
us that land was developable down in that flat area down towards the river?
Developers have looked at that property and have concluded that it is developable. Okay,
Mhm.
so, but at this point, I would be willing to offer that I'd be happy to come to a planning board meeting if you have further discussion, further questions, and have the full board there. I think tonight we had thought we would do a brief update, but we're happy to answer more questions. Is that,
Other questions? Jean?
Well, I was going to say with regard to developability, as I remember, there were 3 lots right along the major road that certainly are developable and were going to be part of the deal of the land that the town would either get or get a conservation restriction on.
correct?
So I think that's responsive to your question.
No, actually, I was,
Just
no,
for the different
no,
land that's
I'm
down in the
referring
meadow.
to the land down, actually, literally down there, which is completely different location.
That's how I understood your question, yes.
And to your other specific question about, I don't want to get into the detail of all this stuff presently, but. To spot zoning, I'm sure town council, you and town council can have a conversation about the legal standard for spot zoning, but. Artie, and Jean, do you agree? That, that if town meeting. Desires and approves the non-binding resolution. To advance zoning at the following town meeting, that we would take it up?
I do agree that, I don't recall if I've seen the, non-binding resolution. Does the non-binding resolution set out this 5% or not? It's not so specific as that.
And,
It does?
As it's written.
Well, I'm a little hesitant about that. I said, I personally would like to talk about that further.
So if we do take it up, and which makes, I mean, it makes some sense. It does make sense to take it up. I don't necessarily see the vote as a mandate per se, is in the town meeting already said they wanted to do something. At the same time, I think it makes sense to take it up to try to see what we can do to preserve some space there. As with Jean, again, the question of the affordable housing component. In that language.
Well, and I do think that part of the purpose of taking up this question is for the seller to understand whether the town remains interested in this process as well. Or that the seller could decide to put it back on the market for single family homes to clear cut the site, so. Then there will not be setbacks of the type that you're asking about at all, but.
I'd be honest, Miriam, I don't go that style as far as fearing what might happen. I just don't do that. I understand that type of stuff can happen. I just don't go down that route type of thing.
Okay.
But I appreciate the possibility.
The last point that I think I would make is Jean made a statement about the planning board not maybe having a specific goal related to access to the Charles and pieces like that. But I would state that the reason why this project came up in the beginning was that this parcel was and is the #1 parcel that the Concom is hoping will be acquired by the town when they had looked at all the land available in town or potentially available in the town. And so that really was the impetus for starting down this road. So,
May I say, I have walked that land many times to discover that land during right at the beginning of COVID, when everybody was out enjoying being outdoors. My husband and I called it the Bluebird Meadow. It is beautiful. I want the town to acquire that land. I'm torn about, but so much in favor of it. I want to make it happen. I have to say that.
so at any rate, my offer stands and I'm happy to come to a planning board meeting or somebody from the select board. If we could maybe wrap this up so we can move to our next discussion for this evening. The second agenda item we have is executive session exception 3. To discuss potential litigation relative to 1688. And I think the order of motions is that the planning board will make a motion first.
So may I have a motion that the planning board convene an executive session for the purposes of discussing strategy with respect to litigation, namely Needham Enterprises Inc. versus Needham Planning Board, Land Court Miscellaneous Case number 22, miscellaneous file number 158, where the chair declares that doing so in open session will have a detrimental impact on the planning board's litigation position, with said executive session to include the select board and to adjourn at the conclusion of the executive session without returning to open session.
So
So moved. Oh, you said
second,
second.
I'll second. We both seconded, we both moved it.
We have a motion by Artie Crocker and a second by Jean McKnight. All in favor,
I think you might want to poll Paul.
Is Paul there too?
Paul is there, so you might want to poll the board.
so if Paul, I've been informed, has been recused on this, does he participate in this vote?
I abstain as I am recusing myself from the meeting.
I understand. So,
Before we vote, should we acknowledge the question?
One
from the members?
question, rationale for under exemption 3. Do I do that after you voted or before?
I'll refer to town council.
Yeah. If you want to entertain the question, you can, I would do it now before you vote.
Yes, I will entertain the question I refer. to council.
Saying, can you specifically say what the detrimental effect would be on litigating this of public body?
We're going to be discussing, the decision of the trial court and the, whether or not to pursue or not an appeal of that decision. And we're doing that in open session, would disclose to the public, among other things, counsel's, analysis of the decision, and the underlying law. And that is best conducted in executive session with the board.
Who's that?
What's that?
Wait,
It's
you
your
know, Peter,
detriment.
this isn't a discussion and it's not an open session or a public discussion. So we've declared that it is taking place under exception 3.
Okay.
All right, and the advice that we have is that that is an appropriate measure, and that is certainly my understanding. Thank you. So I think if you want to pull your board, that would be.
So, all in favor of those present, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
And the top is not present at all.
Right,
Roll call vote.
roll call vote,
Yes,
we'll take the vote again, in alphabetical order, Artie Crocker, Gene McKnight,
Aye.
and the chair, Adam Block, votes aye. We've declared to go into executive session, and we know for the record, we know
Paul
for the-
already
we
abstained.
know for the record that Paul has abstained from the vote and is recused, so he will not be participating in the executive session, and will sign off on Zoom, I suspect.
Why?
Or he may not sign off, he won't participate in.
Why's Paul recusing himself?
We'll chat about that after, we gotta continue with the proceedings.
All right, I move that the select board convene an executive session for the purpose of discussing strategy with respect to litigation, namely Needham Enterprises Inc. versus Needham Planning Board, Land Court Miscellaneous Case Number 22, miscellaneous 000158, where the chair declares that doing so in open session will have a detrimental impact on the planning board's litigation position, and the chair so declares. We said executive session to include the planning board and to adjourn at the conclusion of the executive session without returning to open session. Second. And I need to poll everybody. Marcus,
Aye.
Kevin,
Aye.
Heidi, Kathy, and the chair votes aye. All right, we are in executive session.